Jesus loves me, the Bible tells me so.
All right, you can be seated, and kiddos can... Or you can listen to what the Bible tells us about Jesus loving us. Either way. Our young scholars are all leaving, so... well, again, good morning, and good to just see you today, and hope you are doing well. And we are continuing on in this, hopefully what feels like an ongoing of chapter 3. We're moving into wedding territory, and by that I mean that we're getting into some of the parts of the book of 1 John that a wedding officiant might draw from. In 1 John 3:16, which is in the middle of our passage today, it's a fairly common wedding verse about Christ's love for us and the love we can have for each other. And there's a section in chapter 4, 2 sermons from now, with an even more beloved section on love that I think I've read that section at more weddings I've been a part of than anything else in the Bible. And so we have these highlightable verses, 1 John 3:16. The good ones are always 3:16. Did you notice that? 1 John 3. But what I hope we will kind of notice as we move more slowly through this and as we place these highlightable verses within their actual context, that we see some different shades to these teaching, and we can kind of round out our understanding that even goes deeper and wider than only Jesus loves me, although that's a great place to start. What I mean by that is that we could stand up today and we could just wax poetic the whole time about Christ's love for us based on 1 John 3:16. But what's interesting is that when you look at a verse like that in its context today, you realize that that's not what John himself is primarily trying to communicate in this passage. He's emphasizing Christ's love for us, but he's doing that actually to push us to consider our own love for each other. If you look at the whole passage, it's not primarily about Christ's love. That's something he appeals to make the much bigger and more full point about the sacrificial love required of us in light of Christ's own sacrificial love. And so the message isn't Christ loves us so nothing we do ever matters. That's not really a biblical rendering of our passage today. The message is actually Christ sacrificially loved us, and if we truly understand and have experienced that love, then we will sacrificially love one another. That's much more so the actual thrust of what John is trying to say here, that our love extended to one another, or our lack thereof, actually becomes John's test. It becomes the measurement for how fully we have experienced Christ's love within us. And so this is it's a very rich, it's a very rewarding piece of Scripture before us today, but it's also a challenging one in some ways, and one I will try not to back down from too much. I'll try to let John speak to us today. So we're going to journey through this first block here that is about love primarily, and then it moves into a separate section that is related but feels different about the condition of our hearts. And we'll talk about that a little bit, and then we'll close out today with a reflection and prayer exercise rooted in that last section. So let's reread verses 11 through 15 of chapter 3. This goes right up to the highlight verse of verse 16. John says, "For this is the message you heard from the beginning. We should love one another." You see that's the main message being communicated. "Do not be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own actions were evil and his brothers were righteous. Do not be surprised, my brothers and sisters, if the world hates you. We know that we have passed from death to life because we love each other. Anyone who does not love remains, abides, dwells in death. Anyone who hates a brother or sister is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life remaining, residing, abiding, dwelling in him." So we're far enough into this study now that I hope even in just reading these 5 verses, you can notice like more than a handful of some of these favorite ideas of John that are all being pieced together. The main point here is we need to love each other, but you should start to be able to notice some of the language that John just loves to communicate, some of the images that he likes to kind of put in front of us. So there's an emphasis here on what we have heard from the beginning. We had kind of a whole lesson on how we don't need to be taken away by this Antichrist message. There's this emphasis on the new command to love one another. There's even a reference here to Cain belonging to the evil one. And if you were here last week, if you remember you're either children of the devil or children of God. And we talked about Michael Corleone from The Godfather. But that language actually shows back up here that he says Cain is another one of those people who belongs to the evil one. There's language in here very common to John. The world hates the disciples. Stark contrast between life and death. Stark contrast between hatred and love. He talks about gift of eternal life. So pretty much all the things that John, either in the Gospel of John or 1 John, loves to talk about, he's finally kind of introduced all those ideas already, and here he's bringing them all together. But his main point that he's still trying to make is that we should love one another. It is that new command that Jesus gave on the night he was betrayed, that you all should love as I've loved you. It's that new command that is still sitting as kind of the foremost emphasis that John has for us here. Now, you might have noticed that he also appeals to kind of an unusual Bible story to make his point. Cain and Abel, I feel like, factors into our imaginations a lot, kind of as we're reading Genesis. In fact, one of you recently shared, I need to stay focused probably today, but one of you recently shared a comedy clip with me about how the third person on earth murdered the fourth person on earth, which was a reference to the story. It's quite funny. It sounds dark, but it's like a Christian comedy thing. But so this is in our minds. We know the story of Cain and Abel, but it doesn't really show up in our Bibles very often. This is one of 3 references to Cain that we have anywhere in the New Testament. And this is the longest treatment that story gets anywhere in the New Testament. But basically, John appeals here to Cain as the example of everything he doesn't want the church to become. He says it right there in verse 11. His message is, don't be like Cain. That's the way he's using him. Don't become all of the things that Cain embodied, which is pretty heavy accusations: evil, murder, hatred, death. He says that Cain belonged to the evil one. So he says that's one path you can follow. You can be like Cain, and you can give in to all of these kind of harsh terms that he lays out. And that's one path you can follow. But this is where verse 16 factors in now. He says, if you don't want to follow that path of Cain, obviously there's the path of Abel, who did righteous deeds. But really, Abel, he doesn't focus so much on. In fact, notice Abel's name doesn't even show up anywhere there. But Abel is really it builds up into a reference in verse 16, not to Abel, but to Jesus. And so Jesus becomes the contrast here to Cain. So look at verse 16. He says, this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. That's the part you would share at a wedding. And John is saying that if Cain embodied everything that he doesn't want the church to become, then of course Abel to a degree, but also Jesus to a more full degree, embodies everything that John does want the people in the church to become. John says that we know what love is by the example of Jesus. And I love this line that we kind of take for granted, but we get it from John. He says, who laid down his life for us. And I love that line as I consider that the Apostle John who's writing these words, we believe is the same John who was the only male disciple who actually stayed by Jesus' side that day at Calvary. That this John, who kind of seems in an abstract way saying, this is what we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. Let's remember that we think and we believe that this same John witnessed this event, that he witnessed this act of Jesus, as he says, laying down his life for us. And as John processes that event 5 or 6 decades later, his main memory seems to be that on that day he saw love on display. That on the cross, what he witnessed that day, Jesus laying his life down for us, he says, this is how we know what love is. So I love recalling the fact that John isn't again, just kind of waxing poetic about sacrificial love, but he is bearing witness to an event that he saw flow in front of his eyes. So again, very beautiful line, very quotable, but that's 1 John 3:16a, and I still don't think that's the main point of this whole passage. It's really, he gets back to the point in 1 John 3:16b. So let's read the rest of this verse. That's going to sound familiar to what he was saying in 11 through 15, and he says, "And we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters." So yes, it's beautiful that this is what Christ did for us, but he's using that as an appeal to the same basic plea he's making throughout this whole section, as he's calling them, in light of Christ and in light of the negative example of Cain, he's making an appeal to them to lay down their own lives for each other. Now, of course, he's not saying that they need to be hung on a Roman cross for each other, and he's not saying that we need to do that, but we kind of understand the metaphorical sense in which John is appealing to the cross here and appealing to this idea of laying down our lives for our brothers and sisters. He's saying that we have to die to self and live for others in light of the cross. And hopefully this is an idea we think about a good bit. Now in verse 17 and 18, John continues and he gives some kind of a practical illustration of what he's talking about here. And I'm imagining that through verse 16, this is certainly not for me, this is not where you imagine John was going to go next. Like this practical illustration he gives of laying down their lives for each other is a lot more concrete and a lot more specific than I would have maybe thought he was going to do next. So this is interesting, and I'm guessing that maybe this was because this was an issue going on in the community that John was pastoring. So he next says, "So if all that love stuff is true, Christ's love and our love, if anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them," notice the force behind this question, "how can the love of God be in that person?" That's a really strong question, is it not? He says, "Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth." So it doesn't mean this is the only thing John has on his mind, but the first real illustration John gives of what it actually looks like for brothers and sisters to lay down their lives for each other in light of the cross is actually that they would share material possessions with each other, which again, I don't think is something we wouldn't think about. I just don't know if that's the first thing we would think about. And again, perhaps maybe that this is an issue John is trying to deal with in this community, that they're not even really sharing with each other, or certain people are hoarding possessions or wealth over others in the community. We don't know for sure, but we can see the basic principle here, especially in verse 18, that John is saying, when I'm talking about love, I'm not just talking about words or speech. John seems to know that it's easy even in the first century to be like, I love you, you love me, we're a happy family. You know, we can sing the Barney song in the first, that's a Barney song, right? And back in the first century, which wasn't around yet, but that principle was around, right? He says, it's easy to sing that, I love you, you love me, we're a happy family. He goes, but that's not necessarily what we're interested in. That's a good start. It's good to profess your love for one another. But he says the love we're talking about here, rooted in the example of Jesus Christ on the cross, is not a love that was only shown in words or speech. He says, but with actions and in truth. And so he's calling for these Christians to not just say we're a family that loves one another, but he's calling them to be a family that loves one another. In action, he says, and in truth. The way I think about this is John is saying that their hands will reveal more about their hearts than their mouth will. So if you want to know where their hearts actually are, and we're going to talk about hearts a little bit later, but if you want to know more about the condition of their hearts, you can't really judge only by what people are saying or singing in church or saying out loud when everybody's listening, but you really judge the love, you judge the fruit of the love by the actions. And this is something that is applying here in this certain situation of them not potentially sharing possessions with one another. But I think that's a principle that we could apply in so many different parts of our communal life together. Now, I framed all this a little bit negatively, kind of hinting that we are not loving each other or not loving each other enough, because to my defense, that's kind of how John is framing it. John begins with this extensive appeal to Cain, kind of holding it over their head. Don't be like Cain, church. And then he sort of questions, how can the love of God be in this person? He seems to imply that maybe they're not sharing enough. So John is kind of approaching this, which not in a bad way, but he's just approaching it from kind of a negative light and saying, be careful, guys, remember what we're aspiring to. But I also think there's a way to just frame all of this more positively as well, which preachers don't always like to do that as much. But to say, okay, yes, it's true that we need to be careful that we're loving each other and not just saying we love each other and all that, but also to just recognize what a blessing it is in the church and in our own families to just be given regular opportunities and chances to show the love of Christ to one another. I mean, if it's true what he's saying here, that we embody and we extend and we echo Christ's love to those around us by the way we treat them, well, it becomes a blessing. It becomes a gift. It becomes an opportunity when God puts opportunities for us to do that, to practically lay down our lives for the sake of others. And I thought about so many examples of how this does happen. If we were going to say, don't be like Cain, but to honor and recognize the way it is taking place. And a lot of different ideas come to my mind. But Lacey and I have been, because of our life stage, really the life stage of our parents, we've been talking a lot about this idea of caregiving and some of the burden that people of a certain age have on them when they're caregiving for maybe children and grandchildren, but also doing this generation above them. We've been talking about that a lot. And we were kind of thinking about our family, but I began to think about how many examples we have in our church, even of that really specific life stage, where it's just a very visible illustration of people laying down their own lives for the sake of others. In this instance, it's more so people in their own families, not just our church family. But I was, of course, thinking of Keith and Sherry and the sacrifices they made this week to love Charles well. I was thinking of Cindy Richardson and Ilka, as we prayed for this morning, and her mother, Jackie Rowland, who serves his brother faithfully behind the scenes in a way you would never know, even someone outside of our church family, and he's an elder here as well. So many examples within our church family of doing what we're being told to do in 1 John 3:16, which is to lay down your lives for the sake of others in light of and as a fruit of the way that you've experienced Christ's love. So I just kind of wanted to recognize that, because sometimes it's easy to imply like, you all need to love each other, as if none of us have figured that out by now in our years at church. But to honor and celebrate and give thanks for the practical ways we do have in our lives to lay down our lives for the sake of others. And not all of us are in that same exact life stage where we're trying to be faithful children while being faithful parents and grandparents and trying to be good church members and trying to work and do all this craziness. But that's just one group within our church that I think sets such a beautiful example for the rest of us. So this is the kind of practical aspect of love that John is having us sit with. But there's one more section to this passage, and at first I was going to treat these in different kind of lessons, different sermons, and then I was persuaded that this is really intended to all be one section, that where we go next in 19 to 24 is going to kind of feel like a different sermon for a second. It's not going to be a different sermon in length, I promise. It's going to feel like a different section, but I think as John moves into this teaching about the condition of their hearts, and how they might be feeling in their hearts, this is it flows out of the section we've already looked at. So look first at the beginning of verse 19, and we read this. It says, "This is how we know that we belong to the truth, and how we set our hearts at rest in His presence." So this is another one of those, this is how. In the rest of the section, he's going to basically lay out two different conditions of our hearts, two different scenarios. And this is just kind of how I imagine it. I'm finding this immensely difficult to explain because I don't know if I fully understand it myself. But this is the connection I made. He says, some of you might hear all of this stuff about loving each other and about obedience and about how you are letting the love of God guide you in your life. Some of you may hear that and you may go, boy, I'm on the right track. In this instance, that's not pride. He's saying that's a good thing. Some of you may read this and you may go, that's what I'm doing. And he says some of you are on the right track, and I think his message to those people is just keep on keeping on. And verses, like, we're not going to read it all, but 21, 22, 23, 24, he's just repeating some of the stuff he wants them to be doing. Please God, obey God, love each other, believe in Jesus. And he's like, if that's you and that's your focus right now, keep on keeping on, keep doing your thing. So that's kind of one condition of the heart where you hear this message and you go, okay, I got this, and we're good to go. But there's another condition of the heart he references that I find quite insightful. In verse 20 specifically, he says, if our hearts condemn us, that there's going to be people reading this letter of 1 John, and maybe even just this section in 1 John 3, there's going to be people reading all this I'm not necessarily producing the fruit in my life that I need to produce. And it's interesting to me that condemn you when you hear all this. He says, here's two things to remember. The first thing he says is, God is greater than our hearts. And I don't know precisely what that means, but that's one of those lines that I like how it sounds. I think it's a promise. I think it's a blessing that even for those of us with imperfect hearts, even for those of us with imperfect lives who are maybe hearing teachings on sacrificial love, and we're going, yeah, I'm struggling in that area. He says, we got to remember that God is greater than our hearts, that God can still work powerfully in imperfect people with imperfect hearts. So that's one of the promises. And then the other one is so strange to me, but the other piece of comfort, if you read verse 20 carefully, is that God knows everything. Now, if your heart is struggling, do you find it to be a comfort that God knows everything? At first I was like, that doesn't even make sense. It's not a comfort to me that God knows everything. It's scary to me that God knows everything. But again, I think he's accounting for a heart here that is at struggle, a heart that wants to do good, who knows the message of Jesus, that wants to bear fruit, in light of what Jesus has done for us, but is struggling. And that heart has good in it, and it has bad in it, and there's a little bit of Abel in us, and there's a little bit of Cain in us. And the comfort is actually that God knows everything, that there's nothing in our hearts that he doesn't know. And so it's scary in that he knows those evil thoughts. He knows those temptations. He knows those secret areas of sin, that we can show up here at church and we can fake all kinds of things and we may not pick up on it. But he says God's going to pick up on it. God knows this. But the flip side of that is true as well. And it's intended to be a comfort that those yearnings you have in your heart to love others as Christ has loved you, that maybe don't always get worked out in God and to love others more deeply. It's supposed to be a comfort that God knows that too, that God can see into our hearts. He knows what's in there. He sees those struggles. And John intends this to be a point of assurance for those of us who are struggling with assurance. So I want to read the first two verses of Psalm 139. I'm going to read more of it here in a second. But in the beginning of Psalm 139, David says, "You have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise, you perceive my thoughts from afar." David is saying, there's nothing that goes on in here that God is not privy to. But John is saying, yeah, that might scare you a little bit, but that also should bring you a sense of assurance. Your heart should be able to rest in his presence, knowing that you are an open book before him and you're on this journey with God. So what I thought we might do today as we close, this is a bit abstract, although you will have some time here to just sit and think this through. But I want to give us just about 5 minutes here before we sing our final couple songs. And I have a couple of guiding questions that you can put up there, Nathan, that if these are helpful for you, this 1 John section a little bit, But I want you to have a few minutes here, hopefully that carries into your week, to just kind of acknowledge in your heart before God, maybe the parts of your heart that are, as you read some of this, bringing you condemnation, or as you reflect on your relationship with God, different aspects of your walk, you go, oh, this is not, there's struggles here, this is not so good. The language of John is that our hearts would condemn us. So what are some of those areas? But then also recognize the opposite, right? Where are some of these areas that our hearts feel confident, our hearts feel bold based on the relationship we have with God? And then maybe a wider thing more for the rest of the week is John says that both of these conditions of the heart we're still supposed to be able to rest in his presence. That as we acknowledge who we are and all we are and all we have going on in here, that this is actually supposed to give us a sense of rest and peace in God's presence. So this is some pretty complicated spiritual work and reflection. So let's take about 5 minutes here, reflect, pray. I'm going to come back up in about 5 minutes. I'm going to read a little bit more of Psalm 139 to us, and then we'll be wrapped up in the sermon. But let this be a little bit of a launch point for you this week as we ponder our hearts and what we're feeling inside of them. then we'll have a prayer room opportunity if you need that this morning, and we'll sing our final couple songs. This is Psalm 139. Try to read this, hear this, pray this with our background in 1 John 3 in mind this morning. David says, "O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it all together. You hem me in behind and before and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high, I cannot attain it.